All right, so get ready, because today we are going deep, deep into medieval theories of relations.
Oh,
It's going to be a wild ride.
it is.
Now, you might be thinking,
Ugh.
relations? Like, what do I care what some philosopher from like 1,000 years ago thought about, relationships? But trust me, this stuff is way more relevant than you might think.
It is, yeah.
Because how they were thinking about these connections and these categories really shapes how we still understand the world.
It does, and what's fascinating is they were wrestling with questions that are still relevant today.
Right, exactly.
Like, what are relations? Do they even exist? Or are they just something like our minds made up?
A product of our imagination.
And if they are real, what kind of things are they?
Right, big questions.
Big questions.
So to help us unpack all of this, we are going to be looking at excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
A great resource.
Yeah, it's like our cheat sheet to understand all the big ideas without having to actually go back and read all of these very dense original texts.
The originals can be pretty rough going.
Yeah, exactly.
You need a guide.
So I guess the place to start is with the question of where do we even begin with this whole relations thing?
Well, I mean, you really got to start with the OG himself, Aristotle.
Yeah, always a good place to start.
In his book, The Categories, he lays out this idea that relations are a type of accident.
Okay, wait, hold on. Back up for a second.
Sure.
What do you mean by accidents?
So think of accidents like properties or characteristics of something.
Okay.
So like Aristotle would say a substance, like a person, could have accidents like being tall or being a philosopher.
Okay.
And relations like taller than or father of are just a specific kind of accident, according to Aristotle.
So being taller than is something that exists in a person.
Right.
Just like their height.
Exactly. And this is where medieval philosophers who were building on Aristotle's ideas started running into some real roadblocks.
Okay, boy.
For one thing, they totally rejected the idea of what we call polyadic properties.
Polyadic property.
Polyadic properties.
What is that?
It sounds very sci-fi, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Like something from Star Trek.
It's just a fancy way of saying properties that involve multiple things.
Okay.
So if you think about it, like a family portrait,
Okay.
the family itself isn't like this mystical entity floating above their heads, right?
Right.
It's the individual members
Yeah.
and their relationships to one another, parent, child, sibling. Those are the things that make up that whole.
Okay.
And so they argued that these multi-part properties, they don't really exist as single things in the world.
So there's no one walking around with taller than hanging over their head like a halo.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's a great image.
Yeah.
They insisted that only individual substances and their own properties were real.
Okay, I can see how that would maybe mess with Aristotle's system a little bit.
Yeah.
So how did they try to explain relations then without these multi-part properties?
Yeah.
So they just kind of ditch Aristotle altogether?
Not completely. They were still trying to kind of work within that basic framework,
Okay.
but they split into kind of two main camps.
Okay.
Some, like Peter Oriel, took a radical approach and just said, like, look, relations only exist in the mind.
So taller than only exists when someone is actually thinking about it.
Yeah.
Whoa.
If you really believe there's no such thing as a property that connects two things, then that's kind of the only option you're left with, right?
Okay.
But most medieval philosophers weren't buying it.
They weren't on board.
They weren't on board with that.
Yeah.
They argued that if relations only exist in our minds, then like the whole world starts to get really subjective. Like,
Yeah.
what about the laws of physics? What about cause and effect?
Right. If Simmias is taller than Socrates, only because I think it's true,
Yeah.
that's a little...
It's a recipe for chaos.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
So they needed another explanation.
Yeah. So if most of them didn't agree with that, then what was the alternative?
So the majority of these medieval thinkers were what we call realists. They believed that relations were real, but they had to get creative to explain how they were real without resorting to these forbidden polyadic properties.
Right. Nice.
So this is where we get two main schools of thought.
Okay.
Reductive realism and non-reductive realism.
Okay, so let's start with, I guess, reductive realism.
Okay.
What's the deal with that?
So thinkers like Peter Abelard and William of Ockham, these guys fell into this camp, and they basically said, like, keep it simple, stupid. Relations, they're just regular old accidents seen from a certain perspective.
So no special category needed, just accidents.
Just good old-fashioned accidents doing their thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So, for example, Abelard argued that someone's height is just an accident, but that same accident is what makes them taller than someone else.
Okay.
It's all about how those accidents compare.
So instead of taller than being its own thing,
Right.
it's more like a consequence of comparing heights.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
And Occam, who's famous for Occam's razor,
Yeah.
he was all about cutting out the unnecessary.
Absolutely.
The guy loves simplicity, right?
Yeah.
So he takes this idea even further.
Okay.
And he basically argues that it's our minds that represent the same situation in different ways.
Yeah.
So, like, we can say Socrates is white,
Okay.
which is an absolute statement.
Right.
Or we can say Socrates is similar in color to Plato,
Okay.
which is a relative statement.
So the underlying reality is the same, it's just how we're choosing to describe it.
Exactly. We're just framing it differently.
Clever.
Yeah, a neat little trick, right? Taking these regular old accidents, and just by shifting our perspective, they become relations.
So is everyone cool with that? Everyone agreed?
Hey, not so fast.
Of course not.
Because we've got another group coming in here.
Always the dissenting opinion.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Who were not satisfied with reducing relations to other accidents.
Okay.
These were the non-reductive realists.
Okay, so who are these rebels?
These are the folks that insisted that relations are their own special type of accident.
Ooh, I love it.
Yeah, a little philosophical rebellion going on here.
All right, so who are some of the big names in this non-reductive camp?
So we've got some heavy hitters here.
Okay.
We've got folks like Albert the Great.
Okay.
And he argued that the way we think about relations, with all their kind of unique features, like the fact that they're directed towards something else,
Right.
that suggests they must be a distinct kind of thing.
Okay.
He actually used a visual metaphor.
Ooh, I like metaphors.
He said relations are like things looking out towards something else.
Okay.
I always liked that image. It kind of makes this very abstract concept.
Yeah, a little more concrete.
A little more concrete. And then you have someone like John Duns Scotus.
Oh, yeah, another big name.
Another big name.
And what did SCOTUS think?
Well, Scotus was all about quiddity, or essence.
Okay.
He argued that relations, they have a different essential nature than regular accidents.
Yeah.
So let's take an example. Let's say someone is 6 feet tall.
Okay.
Their height is 6 feet.
Yeah.
That's the accident, right?
Right.
But their tallness, the fact that they are taller than someone else, that is a relation, and it has a different essence.
So it's like tallness is an extra layer on top of height.
Yeah.
And that's what makes that relation that taller than real.
Exactly. For non-reductive realists, relations had their own unique existence, their own special something that made them different.
Okay. So I'm starting to see both sides here.
Yeah.
But it seems like no matter which side you're on,
Right.
whether you're reductive or non-reductive realist, there's still this problem of how can one accident relate to things?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Because it seems like,
You need two to tango.
yeah, you need an accident on each side to make that connection.
And that's where things get really interesting.
I knew it.
And that's what we're going to talk about next time.
Okay, well, we've got to take a quick break, but we will be right back to dive into that very problem after this.
See you soon.
We'll see you in a minute. All right, so we're back, and I am still thinking about this problem of how you can relate two things with only one accident.
Yeah, it was a real head-scratcher for these medieval philosophers.
It really was.
They knew that relations needed counterparts.
Right.
But they also struggled with this idea of how to actually explain this when you're dealing with individual substances and their accidents.
So did they ever figure out how to make that work?
Well, yeah, they came up with a solution that's actually pretty ingenious.
Oh, okay, lay it on me.
It's called relations of reason.
Relations of reason. Okay, now you're just making up words.
Well, it sounds fancy, but the idea is actually pretty simple.
All right, well, help me out here.
Okay, so imagine you're thinking about a friend, right? You have this thought in your mind,
Yeah.
and it's directed towards your friend.
Okay.
Your friend isn't actually affected by your thought, are they?
Unless I have some kind of Jedi mind powers? No.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So medieval philosophers recognized this asymmetry.
Okay.
They were like, fine, maybe there isn't a real accident in the other person that corresponds to this concept of being thought about.
Right.
But they still felt like, conceptually speaking, relations needed this second term.
Okay.
So they came up with this idea of, You're basically projecting a relation onto that other person, even though it doesn't really exist in them.
So it's like I'm drawing a dotted line to my friend.
Yeah.
In my mind.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
The line's not really there.
Right.
But I'm using it to make sense of the connection.
Exactly. These relations of reason, they're like mental projections that we create to complete the picture.
It's like a philosophical cheat code.
Kind of. A way to have your cake and eat it, too.
Yeah.
So you get to acknowledge that we need this counterpart without messing up the idea of individual substances.
Okay. I can see how that might work. But were all the medieval philosophers okay with this idea?
Well, there was debate, of course, but there were some big names who were into this whole relations of reason thing.
So who was team relations of reason?
Well, Thomas Aquinas, for example.
Okay, Mr. Big Shot himself.
He loved this idea.
Okay, and why did he like it so much?
Well, he used it to explain one of the biggest mysteries of all,
which is
God's relationship to creation.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
God is pure simplicity.
Right.
No accidents allowed.
Can't change.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So how can an unchanging God relate to this constantly changing creation?
That's the question, all right.
And Aquinas' answer is relations of reason.
Okay, I'm listening.
He said, God doesn't actually change by relating to us.
Okay.
It's us who are mentally projecting that relation of creator onto God.
It's all in our heads.
Well, it exists for us conceptually, but it doesn't actually affect God.
So we're putting a label on God.
Yeah, you could say that.
But the label itself doesn't change who God is.
Exactly.
Got it.
And this idea, even though it comes from theology, it starts to have some broader implications for how people thought about relations in general.
Okay, so how did it change things?
Well, it kind of shifted the focus from relations as things that relate to relations as concepts.
So what do you mean by that? What's the difference?
Before relations of reason, people were really hung up on the accident itself.
Okay.
But with relations of reason, it's more about the way we think about those accidents.
So less about finding the tallness and more about how we compare things using taller than.
Exactly. And this is where our friend William of Ockham comes back in.
I knew he'd be back. Couldn't resist a good philosophical debate.
He loved simplicity, remember?
Yeah, Occam's razor and all that.
And he takes this idea and runs with it.
Okay, so what did Occam do with it?
He basically said all relations are mental concepts.
Even though the things they describe are real.
Right. So similarity exists as a concept in our minds.
Okay.
But the actual state of being similar, that exists out in the world.
So my idea of similarity is in my head, but Socrates and Plato can still actually be similar.
Exactly. Subtle, but important.
Yeah, my brain is starting to hurt.
This way of thinking, it had a huge impact.
I bet it did.
It's like opening up a whole new dimension of reality.
Okay, hold on. Before we get too far into other dimensions, we need to talk about one more big piece of this puzzle.
All right, what's that?
The Trinity.
Ah, yes, the ultimate relational challenge.
For sure. Because you've got three persons in one substance.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
But how can a substance, which is supposed to be one thing, also have relations, which kind of imply separate parts?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
It is. And how do they even try to answer that?
Well, we've got Aquinas coming back to save the day.
He's our hero.
With a pretty radical solution.
Okay, I'm ready. Tell me.
He said, in the case of the Trinity, the relations are the substance.
Hold on, wait. You're saying Father, Son, Holy Spirit, those aren't just properties of God? They're like the same thing as God.
They're identical to God.
Whoa, that is a big step away from Aristotle.
It is. Aquinas is basically turning everything on its head and saying a substance can be a relation.
So God is a relation.
Yeah.
I need a minute to process this.
It's a mind-blowing concept, for sure.
It really is.
But it shows how far these thinkers were willing to go.
To make their philosophy work with their theology.
Exactly.
And did anyone disagree with Aquinas on this?
Of course.
Of course.
I mean, this is medieval philosophy. Someone is always disagreeing with someone.
Okay, so who else jumped into the ring?
Well, we have another thinker, Gilbert of Poitiers, who took Aquinas' idea and kind of ran with it.
Ran with it? Where do you even go from God is a relation?
Well, he suggested that maybe created things could be relations.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. So not just God, but like everything.
That was his proposal.
That's wild.
He argued that substances are made up of their relations to other things.
So instead of thinking of a chair as its own thing, it's actually just a bunch of relations to other stuff.
That was his idea.
Okay, so that one didn't really catch on, did it?
Not really, but it shows just how much these debates were really shaking things up.
Yeah, for sure.
Changing how people understood reality.
So we've gone from Aristotle saying relations are just accidents,
right,
to relations of reason.
Yeah.
A God is a relation.
Yeah.
And even maybe everything is a relation.
It's a wild ride.
It is. And what I find so amazing is how all of this stuff from like 1,000 years ago is still relevant to us today.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what we're taking for granted today that future philosophers will look back on and be like, what were they thinking?
That is a great question.
So keep asking those questions, folks.
That is all the time we have for today, but thank you for joining us on the deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.
See ya.
All right, so we're back and ready to tackle the big one.
The Trinity.
Oh, yeah. Trying to figure out how the Trinity works with these ideas of substance and relation was a real challenge for these medieval thinkers.
Oh, for sure. You've got God as three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right. 3 in 1, 1 in 3.
But also one indivisible substance.
It's enough to make your head spin, even without all this philosophy.
Right. And then the big question is, how can these three persons have actual relationships with each other?
Right.
If God's supposed to be this, like, totally unified substance.
Exactly. Because if you say those relations are just accidents,
yeah,
then it's like God's made up of parts.
Which is a big no-no.
Yeah. Totally goes against that whole idea of God's simplicity.
So they had to figure out, like, how would those relations be real
right,
and actually part of God?
Without, like, splitting God up.
Yeah, without dividing that essence.
So how did they do it?
Well, Aquinas comes to the rescue again.
Of course he does.
With a pretty radical solution.
I bet. What did he say?
He said that in the Trinity, the relations are the substance.
Wait, hold on. Back up a second.
Sure.
You're saying Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Those aren't just things about God.
Right.
They're like God.
Yeah, identical with God.
Okay, that is not what Aristotle had in mind.
No, not at all. It's like Aquinas took Aristotle's idea and just flipped it completely around.
So God is a relation.
Pretty much.
I'm going to need a minute to think about that one.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, for sure.
It is. But it really shows how far these thinkers were willing to go.
Yeah, to make their philosophy match their theology.
So did everyone agree with Aquinas on this?
Of course not. You know, it's medieval philosophy. There's always someone who disagrees.
Right. So who else had something to say about this?
Well, we have another thinker, Gilbert of Poitiers.
Okay.
And he kind of took what Aquinas said and pushed it even further.
Okay, how do you even go further than that? Where do you go from God as a relation?
Well, he suggested that maybe even created things could be relations.
Wait, hold on. Not just God, but like everything.
That was his idea.
That's a pretty big claim.
It is. He said that maybe substances are just made up of their relations to other stuff.
So a chair is not a chair. It's just a bunch of relations to other things.
That was his argument.
Okay, so then we didn't really catch on, did it?
Not really.
Yeah.
But it shows how much these debates were changing how people saw the world.
Yeah, that's for sure. So we started with Aristotle saying relations are accidents.
Yeah.
And we ended up with relations of reason.
God is a relation.
Maybe everything's a relation.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. And what I find so amazing is how these ideas from so long ago still matter today.
Yeah, it makes you think, like, what ideas do we have now that people will look back on in 1,000 years and be like, what were they thinking?
Right. What crazy ideas are we just taking for granted? That's a great question to ponder. And that is all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you next time for another exploration of the world of ideas.
See you then.